I previously posted a video on my channel about the Cavalcante Mafia family, which many people say was the inspiration for David Chase when he created The Sopranos. However, there's another gang from New Jersey that could give the Cavalcantes a run for their money. I'm talking about Ruggerio Boiardo's gang from Newark, which was part of the Genovese family. What's more, Boiardo himself is considered the inspiration for the movie character Vito Corleone. Today, I invite you to listen to his story and decide for yourself how accurate these assumptions are. Meet Ruggerio Boiardo on the other side of the law. Before you continue watching, I'd like to ask for your financial support of the channel. At the link in the description, you can find my store-branded merch with exclusive prints designed by me. If you have the opportunity and you like something, please buy it, so you can help the channel to develop. Thank you in advance, and enjoy your viewing! Ruggerio Boiardo was born in 1890 in the town of Marigliano, not far from Naples. Until the age of 6, he lived in an orphanage, where his parents had left him shortly after birth. He was then adopted by a peasant couple, Maria Favarulo and Antonio Esposito. At the age of 11, he immigrated from Italy to the United States. His adoptive father had moved there a few months earlier. The family had no influential relatives or connections, so they had to rely on their own resources. Ruggerio and his parents would move to Chicago, where he worked as a shepherd on the outskirts of town. At the age of 14, Ruggerio got a job with a railroad company where he repaired train tracks. When Ruggerio was 16, his parents divorced and his mother moved him to Newark, where her relatives lived. In his new home, Ruggerio went to work at a leather factory, then worked as a bricklayer for a while. In 1912, he married, and a year later became a father. At the same time, Ruggerio got into trouble with the law for the first time. He was found guilty of domestic violence and received a 1-year suspension. Apparently, the money Ruggerio earned through honest labor was not enough for him. In 1920, he was fined $50 for running a gambling house. A year later, Boiardo served his first prison sentence for involvement in a traffic accident that resulted in the death of an 8-year-old child. He was charged with manslaughter and sentenced to 1 year in prison. Boiardo's life would change dramatically. In 1919, the Volstead Act, better known as the Prohibition, was passed, banning the production and sale of alcohol. If the government thought that citizens would stop drinking immediately after the law passed, it was mistaken. People drank just as much as before, and in New Jersey, as throughout the country, many speakeasies appeared. These were establishments where alcohol could be obtained under the counter. The New Jersey coast seemed to have been created specifically for bootleggers' operations. Many small vessels and motorboats sailed there to pick up their cargo from ships delivering alcohol from Canada and Europe. In secluded spots along the coast, crates of booze were loaded into cars and then distributed throughout the country. However, alcohol that came into the United States by sea was very expensive, and many people could not afford it. But demand had to be met somehow, so homemade wine and beer were sold in poor immigrant neighborhoods, and for those who wanted something stronger, there was moonshine. Immigrant families set up home distilleries in basements, backyards, and garages, and began to earn a living by making alcohol. Newark, given its geographic location, became one of the centers of bootlegging. Boiardo began bootlegging in the early 1920s. At the time, he worked as a milk delivery man for the Alderney Dairy Company. While delivering milk to bars, Ruggerio learned that in addition to milk, these establishments were ordering hair gel on an industrial scale. It turned out that hair gel contained alcohol, and when mixed with cologne and prune juice with caramel, it produced a drink that vaguely resembled whiskey. Boiardo decided to take a chance and arranged to buy technical alcohol from John Serpico, who had also immigrated from Marigliano in August 1901. Boiardo then resold it at a profit to those who made the alcohol suitable for human consumption. Soon he gave up milk delivery and focused on reselling liquor. In 1925, Boiardo joined a gang of bootleggers led by Frank Chichi Masocchi. The Masocchi brothers, Frank, Domenico, and John, owned an illegal bar called the Victory Cafe. Boiardo's responsibilities included managing this establishment. But sometimes he was involved in other shady dealings, as the Masocchi brothers also made a living from robbery and looting. In the same year, 1925, Boiardo even had to spend 6 months in prison for illegal possession of a weapon. Upon his release from prison, Ruggerio received a small promotion. Now, in addition to looking after the bar, he had to manage the brothers' underground distilleries. Ruggerio had to rent farms where alcohol was produced at low prices. And since most of these farms were located in rural areas, it was easy for the gang to stay one step ahead of the law by moving from one farm to another. It's worth noting that the clandestine production of alcohol in those years was not only a profitable but also a dangerous occupation. The vapors coming out of the distillation apparatus were highly flammable. Most bootleggers, wanting to save money wherever possible, used open flames instead of special heating coils to heat the containers. Very often, especially during the cold season, workers closed all the windows and doors, causing alcohol vapors to accumulate in the rooms. On October 25, 1927, failure to comply with safety regulations led to one of the Mazzocchi brothers' distilleries exploding, killing 2 people. 2 years later, there was an explosion in a distillery belonging to Boiardo himself, in a garage near his home. Firefighters determined that the explosion was caused by a carelessly discarded cigarette. A river of burning alcohol spilled out onto the street, setting nearby cars on fire. There were casualties. One of Boiardo's employees was killed. Ruggerio himself was arrested and later charged with buying stolen property. It turned out that the same garage had been used to store about 80 barrels of booze, which had been stolen at some point. After these setbacks, Ruggerio decided to distance himself from the Mazzocchi gang. In 1928, he broke with them for good and assembled his own team, which included several guys who had previously worked for the Mazzocchis's. Among these guys, the Russo brothers, Ralph, Anthony, nicknamed Little Pussy, and John, Big Pussy, attracted particular attention. After leaving the Mazzocchis's, Boiardo opened several illegal bars, engaged in racketeering and bootlegging, and organized underground lotteries. In short, he did whatever he could to get by. Boiardo sought to expand his influence beyond New Jersey. He managed to find common ground with several gangs from New York and was particularly close with gangsters from Brooklyn. Back when Boiardo was working for the Mazzocchi brothers, one of the farms where moonshine was produced was next door to a similar farm where the Brooklyn gangsters worked. Apparently, this farm belonged to Frankie Yale, who was later murdered. After Yale's death, a vacuum was created in Brooklyn, which Boiardo was not averse to filling. However, there's no reliable information as to whether he sufficiently managed to extend his influence over Brooklyn. By the early 1930s, Boiardo was feeling quite confident. He owned an extensive network of underground businesses that produced alcohol almost around the clock. He also owned several popular illegal bars that were frequented by the most influential people in the country, from businessmen to politicians to police officers, and his team was one of the most feared in the entire state. At the same time, Boiardo led a double life. He skillfully combined his illegal earnings with the life of a law-abiding citizen and was involved in charity work. Boiardo invested some of his money in the construction of a local church and often organized free meals for the needy during holidays. According to some estimates, at the height of the Great Depression, Boiardo spent a huge amount for the time on charity, between $3 million and $4 million. However, his former bosses, the Mazzocchi brothers, did not fail to notice that their former protege had managed to rise so well. The brothers began to interfere in Boiardo's business, stealing his trucks loaded with alcohol and attacking his bookmakers. Moreover, the Mazzocchi's subordinates, brothers Joseph and Philip Rosso, also going by Rossi, openly traded drugs on Boiardo's territory, not only violating his ban, but also mocking him, as Boiardo was against drug dealing. Because of these conflicts, a war broke out on the streets of Newark in the summer of 1929. One of the first victims of that war was a bootlegger named James Lemon, who was shot dead in Garfield. Although his involvement in Boiardo's business was never proven, the police believed that the murder was motivated by the feud between Ruggerio and the Mazzocchis's. Soon, Boiardo struck back. In broad daylight, his men attacked 2 unarmed guys from the Mazzocchi crew, Agostino Dell'Appia and Vincenzo Follo. They started to run, but after the chase that lasted several blocks, they were caught and killed. The Mazzocchis's continued to suffer losses. On December 4, 1929, Joseph Rosso, who was also known behind his back as the Mazzocchi's key lieutenant, was shot dead. Like Dell'Appia and Follo, he was killed near Victory Cafe by Frank Nappi and Anthony Russo. Nappi had a personal score to settle with Rosso, as Joseph had shot him in the leg in June of that year, leaving him lame. When police learned of the murder, Boiardo and 29 other members of his crew were arrested and interrogated. All of them were considered potential participants in the murder. Boiardo denied any involvement in Follo's murder, but John Russo, after being interrogated all night, confessed to the murder. As a result, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison, and Nappi, as an accomplice, received 3 years. Did this stop the series of murders? No. A few months later, Frank Chichi Marsocchi was killed. The wounded Frank was rushed to the hospital where police officers were waiting to talk to him, but he refused to name his attackers. A few hours later, he was dead. It seemed that Boiardo's enemies were on the verge of defeat. However, on the night of November 27, 1930, the eve of Thanksgiving, Boiardo himself nearly died. As he left his mistress's apartment and headed for his car, where his personal driver was waiting, shots rang out from a shotgun. He was wounded in the head and chest and fell to the pavement. Despite his serious injuries, Boiardo survived. The reaction of his driver, Joe Giuliano, is interesting in this regard. Instead of helping his wounded boss, Giuliano could think of nothing better than to drive away from the scene. Residents of the house near where the hit attempt took place later told police that they did not hear any shots, only the moans of the wounded Boiardo, but thought he was just drunk and therefore did not react. Ruggerio lay in a pool of his own blood for about half an hour until he was found by a milkman making his morning rounds. He called the police, who quickly took Boiardo to the hospital. Detectives concluded that Boiardo had been shot from the house across the street. A double-barreled shotgun was found in the second-floor apartment, one of the barrels unloaded and the other loaded with buckshot. The police found the assassination attempt very strange. On the one hand, it was clear that it had been planned by a team of professionals. It turned out that 2 men had rented the apartment several weeks before the attack, and the nature of the attempt itself indicated that the hired killers had studied Boiardo's lifestyle and daily routine well. In the bathroom, the police found a rope tied to the radiator, which the killers had intended to use to escape. No fingerprints were found in the room itself. On the other hand, the cops were puzzled by the weapon used in the hit. The shotgun found was more than 20 years old, and an examination later established that it had been used often, as indicated by the wear and tear on the barrels. The driver's behavior seemed particularly strange to the police. Not only did he leave his boss to die, but it also turned out that he parked the car on the wrong side of the street, right under the windows from which the shots were fired. After fleeing the scene, Giuliano drove to Boiardo's home, where he told his wife what had happened. The police decided to question Giuliano, who told them that Boiardo had ordered him to park the car in that spot, and that he left after the shooting because he thought it was the sound of a truck engine starting up. Giuliano later changed his testimony. He told detectives that he heard gunshots and decided to drive around the corner. After leaving the scene of the attempt, Giuliano turned around and saw that his boss was lying on the ground, surrounded by frightened residents of the house. Deciding that they would not leave his boss in trouble, Giuliano drove to Boiardo's wife with a clear conscience. At the hospital, as paramedics were removing Boiardo's clothes, a revolver fell out of his pants pocket. A detective who was present searched his clothes and found a stiletto knife in his pocket. He shook Boiardo and asked him whose weapons they were, and Boiardo replied that they belonged to him. This confession would later cause Ruggerio a lot of trouble. The law officers decided to use all the available evidence against him. A few days after the assassination attempt, he was charged with illegal possession of a weapon. At the same time, investigators also seized all books and records from Lucien Trading Company, Boiardo's legal business, which sold perfumes and toiletries. It turned out that the company had not been paying taxes. The tax authorities stated that they had enough evidence to prosecute Boiardo for tax evasion, among other things. The judge set the bail at $25,000. Boiardo's friends paid the money, and he immediately went home. His lawyers sought a postponement of the trial, citing their client's poor health. In the end, the trial was postponed twice and took place on February 18, 1931. The prosecution's case was based on the testimony of several police officers, who claimed that after the gun was found, Boiardo admitted that it belonged to him and that he carried it for self-defense. Boiardo's lawyer, Victor de Aloia, accused the police of not only failing to find his client's potential killers, but also to bring them to justice. The lawyer then suggested that the gun could have been planted by the police. As for Boiardo, he denied that he admitted the gun was his at the hospital. In the end, the jury found Boiardo guilty of carrying an unregistered weapon. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Of course, the press and the public were interested in who was behind the attack. Various versions were considered, ranging from members of his own team to the husbands of women who hung around with Boiardo. At one point, the press considered Abner "Longy" Zwillman, a gangster with considerable influence in New Jersey at the time, to be the prime suspect. He was close to Joe Rainfield, a Polish immigrant from Newark who lived on the same street as Boiardo and was also involved in bootlegging. Around the same time, Boiardo began working with Antonio Caponegro, and together they owned a lucrative counterfeit alcohol business. At some point, Boiardo's men began stealing trucks loaded with liquor belonging to Rainfield. However, there is a version which says there was no conflict between Boiardo and Longhi. The truck thefts took place without Boiardo's knowledge, and when he found out about them, he tried to pay Longhi and his men the appropriate compensation. Boiardo himself, several decades after these events, admitted that there had indeed been a conflict with Longhi, but that it was not Joe Rainfield who was involved, but Dutch Schultz. Boiardo's team was transporting a shipment of beer provided by Schultz to Newark, and Zwilman's men seized the cargo. When Boiardo had already begun serving his sentence in Trenton State Prison, rumors reached him that there were disagreements within his team and that his once loyal assistants were trying to organize their own teams, so he decided to appoint a temporary boss. This was Vincenzo Santoniello, also known as Don Gigi. He was a seasoned criminal who had just been released from prison after serving 17 years for murder. Boiardo's lawyers did everything in their power to secure his early release. They were unable to get him out on parole, but they did manage to get Boiardo transferred from Trenton to Crosswicks, where there was a prison with much more lenient conditions. In his new place, Boiardo worked as a stoker and tended flowers on the prison farm, and in his free time, he organized lively drinking parties. At some point, his behavior even came to the attention of the authorities, who initiated an investigation, but no violations were found. There were also rumors that Boiardo regularly traveled from Crosswicks to his home in Newark. Such lax supervision allowed Boiardo to run his team's affairs from his prison cell, but such leadership was not the most effective. One of Boiardo's subordinates, Ralph Russo, taking advantage of the fact that his boss was in prison and the Masalki clan had been defeated and unable to interfere, went off the rails. Without asking his boss's permission, he increased the tributes that local merchants paid for the safety of their businesses and pocketed the difference. It seemed as if Russo thought that Boiardo was going to be behind bars for at least 20 years, not 2. But on November 23, 1932, Boiardo was released on parole. He immediately regained his position, put an end to Ralph Russo's pocketing, and even compensated those who had suffered from the actions of his zealous protege. This was not a matter of humanity, but cold calculation. Boiardo was restoring his reputation because prohibition was soon to be replaced, and he had to move his business into the legal sphere. In December 1933, prohibition became a thing of the past. Boiardo reduced his distilleries but left some of them, as not everyone could afford to buy legal alcohol due to its high cost. He compensated for his losses simply by paying more attention to extortion, usury, and gambling. At the same time, Boiardo was actively trying to infiltrate the trade unions. Ruggerio also did not forget the disservice that Ralph Russo had done him. Boiardo began to notice that his assistant was becoming a burden and attracting unnecessary attention to him. For some time, the boss hoped that Russo would come to his senses, but this never happened. First, Russo and his partner, Anthony Money Alfoni, were arrested for the attempted murder of Undertaker Jerry Spatola Jr., but were released because Spatola was unable to identify them in court. In the fall of 1933, Russo, Joseph Giuliano, and Boiardo were called to court as witnesses in the murder case of New York racketeer David Zipper, who worked for Boiardo. Russo and his partner managed to get off scot-free this time. In June 1934, Russo was arrested for several robberies in the Newark area. At this point, Boiardo's patience had run out, and he began to clean house. In May 1934, an attempt was made on the life of Joseph Giuliano, whom Boiardo suspected of working for the cops. In a strange twist of fate, the assassination attempt took place 5 blocks from where Boiardo himself had once been shot. Giuliano survived, refused to identify his attackers in court, and then went into voluntary exile in South Jersey. On February 18, 1936, Boiardo finally dealt with the main troublemaker in his ranks. That day, Ralph Russo was shot dead. In this way, he showed all members of his team that he was ready to eliminate anyone who posed a risk to its future. FBI informants reported that Anthony and John Russo knew that their boss was going to kill their older brother, but not only did they not intervene, they did not even attempt to avenge him in the future. John was serving a 30-year sentence for the murder of Joseph Russo, while Anthony was just starting his career with the Boiardo team. In 1939, John Russo was pardoned by the governor and released, becoming Boiardo's right-hand man. By that time, Boiardo's team was a well-oiled machine. Although bootlegging had been outlawed by then, he managed to compensate for the loss of income through loan sharking, illegal gambling, extortion, racketeering, and other types of crime. Boiardo also owned shares in several casinos in Cuba. Sometime later, when power in Cuba passed to Castro, Ruggerio managed to move his business to such picturesque corners of the globe as Antigua, Curaçao, and the Bahamas. Around the same time, Ruggerio's son, Anthony Boiardo, or Tony Boy, born in 1918, was growing up. The older Boiardo apparently had no plans for him to follow in his footsteps and wanted his son to get a good education, something he himself had been unable to obtain. As Boiardo's relatives later recalled, one day, in a fit of rage over Tony Boy's poor school grades, Boiardo chained him to a pipe in the basement and left him there for several hours. But despite such progressive parenting methods, Tony Boy never received a good education. He was transferred from one school to another until he dropped out altogether at the age of 18. Instead, he decided to start making money. In 1937, in partnership with the former boxer Henry Abrams, he opened a restaurant. The establishment was registered under Tony Boy's name, as he was the only one of the owners who could obtain a liquor license. Abrams had a criminal record and was unable to get one. As a result, the restaurant, called Vittorio Castle, became one of the most famous establishments in the entire state. Various celebrities could be often found there, including Tony Boy's friend, the great baseball player Joe DiMaggio. When World War II began, Tony Boy enlisted in the Air Force. However, his service was not particularly arduous, as he was stationed not far from his home in Long Island. Tony Boy rose to the rank of sergeant and was discharged in 1944 due to poor health. There's also a rumor, unconfirmed but not refuted, that Tony Boy visited a private psychoanalyst during those years. This story is often recalled when Boiardo's team is compared to Tony Soprano's team. But in the case of young Boiardo, there's too little information to speak of this as a fact. Only one thing is known for certain: if he did visit a specialist of this kind, he did so with the utmost caution and discretion, without making it public, unlike Frank Costello, who visited the renowned psychotherapist Robert Hoffman. By that time, Father Boiardo had come to terms with the situation and decided that his son could be useful to him. Tony Boy began helping his father manage his gambling business and alcohol production. His mentor in this endeavor was John Russo, who had known the boss's son since childhood. In 1946, the older Boiardo finally became a member of the Mafia, joining the family now known as the Genoveses. He was later made a captain and effectively became the head of the family in New Jersey. Just as Boiardo joined the family, its boss, Charlie Luciano, was deported to Italy and replaced by Frank Costello. A few years later, Tony Boy was also accepted into the family. At the same time, Tony Boy began working with Jerry Catena, who was both a friend and an enemy of the entire Boiardo gang. He was once an ally of Longhi Zwillman and organized attacks on Ruggiero's business, but a few years later, he was the best man at Tony Boy's wedding and a welcome guest at the Boiardo's estate. Jerry Catena skillfully avoided publicity and trouble with the law, carefully maintaining his reputation as a law-abiding businessman. However, in the mid-1950s, during the FBI's campaign against organized crime, he was unable to escape attention. Edgar Hoover had a file on Catena, which was rumored to be about 4,600 pages long, longer than those of Capone, Genovese, or Luciano. In 1963, Catena became truly famous when Joseph Valachi, the first Mafia member to publicly acknowledge its existence, mentioned his name in the testimony before a Senate committee. It is noteworthy that Valachi also mentioned the Boiardo family at the same time, saying that he was subordinate to Catena and that Tony Boy was a simple soldier. Rumor has it that when this news reached Father Boiardo, he made a pun, rhyming Valachi's surname with the Italian word Pagliacci, which translates to clowns. But jokes aside, Boiardo still received a summons for questioning. Tony Boy had become close to Catena several years before Joseph Valachi's revelations. Initially, their relationship was purely business, but they gradually became friends. Ruggerio had no objection to this friendship. Their relationship was so close that on November 11, 1957, Boiardo's estate in Livingston hosted a gathering of the top cream of organized crime at the time. This meeting was organized by Jerry Catena and Vito Genovese to calm the public after the hit attempt on Frank Costello and the murder of Albert Anastasia. 4 days after this meeting, on November 15th, the infamous Appalachian meeting took place, during which local police arrested about 58 high-ranking mafia members from across the country. But let's get back to Boiardo. Despite the fact that Ruggerio surrounded his son with worthy mentors who had a lot to teach him, Tony Boy was not doing well in his duties. It even got to the point where his bookies were being robbed by the Puerto Ricans, while Tony Boy, instead of protecting his territory, was traveling around the country and having fun. At the same time, an FBI report quoted an informant saying Tony Boy is not well liked, and he will remain in power only as long as his father is alive. Another report stated that Boiardo is most concerned about what will happen to his son when he dies. Soon, the FBI obtained an audio recording of a conversation between Gyp DeCarlo and Anthony Russo. The men discussed how selfish and repulsive Tony Boy was and how impossible it was to work with him. DeCarlo recalled how Tony Boy had bragged about killing a couple of guys without getting approval from the family leadership. Anthony agreed with DeCarlo on everything and went so far as to say out loud that Tony Boy deserved to be killed. On September 23, 1960, the opinions of Boiardo's team members were confirmed. Tony Boy was causing real problems. That day, he arranged a meeting with Pasquale Smudgy Antonelli at the Fremont Club. The reasons for this meeting vary. Either Smudgy had organized his own bookmaking business on Tony Boy's territory without permission, or he simply owed him a lot of money. When Smudgy arrived at the meeting, there were only 4 people in the club: Tony Boy, John Russo, Jimo Calabresi, and the inevitable bartender, Natali Lento. It's difficult to determine what was discussed, as there are several different and contradictory versions of the events. But the outcome is clear. At some point, a brawl broke out in the club, during which John Russo, armed with a gun, grappled with Smudgy. Shots were fired, wounding Russo, Smudgy, Calabresi, and Tony Boy. All those involved in the brawl fled to hospitals where, despite serious injuries, Russo, for example, was wounded in the stomach and Smudgy in the chest, they managed to survive. As for Tony Boy, he was wounded in the legs but also managed to leave the scene of the crime. This incident provoked a real crisis in the organization. First, rumors spread throughout Newark that lottery operations would cease completely, as Tony Boy had fled the city and John Russo was in intensive care. More rumors spread across town that Boiardo's right-hand man, John Russo, would go back to prison for violating the terms of his parole due to the shooting he allegedly orchestrated. The extensive network of bookmakers and loan sharks was essentially left to its own devices. Ruggerio himself was vacationing in Italy at the time, but upon learning what was happening at home, he immediately cut his vacation short and returned. When detectives arrived at Father Boiardo's home, he told them that his son had left him a note saying that he had gone to Puerto Rico for a couple of days on business. The detectives checked the passenger lists of all airlines flying to Puerto Rico and found that no passenger with that name had checked in for any of the flights. Tony Boy's mother-in-law even claimed that he had left for Florida 2 days before the incident at the club. The police also questioned Calabresi and Russo, but failed to take into account one circumstance. Shortly before the interrogation, they had met with Joseph Lordi, an assistant investigator who, being one of Ruggerio's men, had informed the gangsters what to say during the interrogations. A month and a half later, on November 8th, Tony Boy appeared limping at the Essex County Prosecutor's office. He explained that he had been injured when he fell on a pier in Miami, where he had gone to visit a friend. The young Boiardo claimed that he had no idea about the shooting at the Fremont Club, and had only come to the prosecutor because he had learned that he was wanted for questioning. Tony Boy expressed a desire to cooperate with the investigation, stating that he had left New Jersey on the evening of September 22nd and even allowed a police surgeon to examine the scars on his legs. But a week later, when he appeared before a state court, there was no trace of his previous cooperation. He refused to answer almost all questions, citing the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. John Russo and Calabresi were above suspicion, so the only person charged in the incident was Smudgy. But he claimed that he was the only person who fired shots that morning and covered for everyone else. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison. As for Tony Boy, he was found guilty only of contempt of court and sentenced to 30 days. On the same day, Tony Boy was released from custody after posting bail of $1,000. But it wasn't that simple. A few days after the shooting at the club, the local prosecutor's office announced the launch of a special investigation by the Essex County Grand Jury into gambling and racketeering. The investigation correctly concluded that what happened at the Fremont Club was not just a drunken brawl, but an incident linked to organized crime. Subsequently, Prosecutor Byrne, one of the initiators of the investigation, even admitted to FBI agents that the grand jury had been convened specifically to determine whether Tony Boy had been in the Fremont Club at the time of the shooting. On May 21, 1961, the grand jury returned 13 indictments against 10 people. The defendants included not only Smudgy, Calabresi, and John Russo, but also several other members of Boiardo's crew. What connection did they have to the shooting at the club? The prosecution declined to reveal its sources, but stated that it had a star witness at its disposal. The trial itself was scheduled for September 25th. The star witness turned out to be the bartender, Natalie Lento. However, on September 11th, 2 weeks before the trial was due to begin, he was reported missing. He was last seen driving his own car on September 7th. His disappearance threw the local prosecutor's office into disarray, and even the FBI was called in to help find Lento. But Lento seemed to have vanished into thin air. One of the informants later reported that Ruggerio had personally contacted Lento. He tried to convince the bartender to recant his testimony, which apparently made it clear that Tony Boy had been in Fremont at the time of the shooting. Boiardo even offered to pay off Lento's debts and take care of his family if he went to jail for changing his testimony. However, Lento refused. He's still considered missing, and the same FBI informants believed that gangsters from Brooklyn were most likely involved in his disappearance. The vanishing of such an important witness ruined the prosecution's case. Tony Boy appealed the contempt of court ruling but lost, and in July 1961 went to prison where his health problems resurfaced, the same ones that had forced him to leave the military. Father Boiardo was enjoying his retirement at the time. Back in the summer of 1939, he bought 29 acres of land in Livingston, New Jersey, 15 miles from Newark, where he began building his estate. It consisted of 4 houses, an enclosure, a barn, swimming pools, a hunting lodge, a garden, tennis courts, and basketball courts. In the early 1960s, succumbing to the panic that swept across America after the Cuban Missile Crisis, he added a bomb shelter capable of withstanding a nuclear strike. Ruggerio had no education, but he had a lot of money, so he spared no expense in building his estate. His aesthetic tastes were difficult to pin down, but one thing was clear: he loved the Middle Ages. Being an orphan, he decided that his ancestor was the Renaissance poet and politician Matteo Maria Boiardo, a conclusion he came to solely because they had the same last name. Tony Boy indulged all of his father's fantasies and, during a trip to Italy, hired a company in Florence to research his family tree. The research confirmed that Ruggerio Boiardo was indeed a descendant of Matteo. In 1967, Boiardo attracted the attention not of historians but of journalists from Life magazine. They launched their own investigation into the brazen empire of organized crime based on corruption, terror, and murder. The magazine published a series of articles, one of which was illustrated with a color photograph of the Boiardo home. The caption read, "The Capo's Creepy House, a monument to mafia murders." The article caused a sensation, to say the least. It claimed that Ruggerio not only killed people on his estate, but also burned their bodies in a furnace located in the backyard. The journalist did not specify the exact number of victims, but referred to a recording of a conversation between Anthony Russo and Gyp DeCarlo. Anthony had advised his friend to stay away from the furnace, assuring him that he had personally dragged one of the victims there by a chain that was tied to the victim's throat. Other journalists picked up the baton from Life, and soon the New York Times published an even more epic article, which again, referring to Anthony and Gyp, stated that the Boot, as Boiardo was nicknamed, not only personally roasted his victims, but also helped dispose of the bodies for anyone else who wanted to, including Thomas Lucchese. According to FBI documents, the older Boiardo was furious about these articles. He denied that there was even an oven on his property, and in one conversation with a police informant, even said that since his bootlegging days, he had given up the idea of using his home for any illegal activities. But thanks to these articles, Boiardo became truly popular. He hadn't received this much attention since Prohibition. He even received a letter from a 22-year-old girl from Miami who sent her photo and asked for permission to visit the farm. Boiardo really wanted to invite her to visit, but ultimately decided against it, fearing that she might be working for the feds. However, this fame brought Boiardo a lot of headaches. Photographers and reporters could now be found at the entrance to the house. Helicopters circled overhead from time to time, and curious onlookers gathered around the fence. Once, Boiardo's security guards almost shot a man who was trying to break into the house. It turned out he was a salesman. There's also a rumor according to which, thanks to an article in Life magazine, director Francis Ford Coppola learned about the Boiardo house, and it was his home that was used as a model for the house where Don Vito Corleone lived. Some film historians go even further and believe that the opening scene of that great film, The Wedding of Connie Corleone and Carlo Ricci, was partly copied from the celebrations in honor of Tony Boy's marriage. However, those who attended the young Boiardo's wedding refute this claim, saying that Tony Boy's wedding was much more solemn and lavish. But Ruggiero's thoughts were not limited to mere curiosity. He did not like Anthony Russo's loose tongue. While the entire Boiardo team remained very reserved, and Anthony's older brother John was almost a paragon of virtue. Anthony's loquaciousness was as loud as his beloved pink Cadillac with a convertible top. Anthony also disliked Tony Boy. When, at the end of the 1940s, Father Boiardo decided to quietly step down and hand over the reins to his son, he took away Anthony's loan sharks and bookmakers. Tony Boy did this because they regularly delayed their payments. Anthony even complained about this situation to his brother, but he couldn't do anything about it. Ruggerio tried to defuse the situation. In the late 1950s, Vito Genovese's driver, the notorious Vincent Gigante, was sent to prison for attempting to murder Frank Costello. Genovese needed a driver. Boiardo arranged for Anthony Russo to get the job, but a few days later, Russo betrayed Don Vito by killing a man without his boss's permission. Anyone without connections and such protection might have paid for such a mistake with their life, but Boiardo managed to smooth things over. Anthony was sent away to Florida, where he ran gambling operations. Anthony was quite successful in this field, but at the most crucial moment, he managed to ruin everything. In March 1969, while drunk, he got into a fight with the lawyer of Santo Trafficante Jr., the head of the Tampa Mafia. The truth is that Anthony had been persistently offering Santo Trafficante to organize new gambling operations for a long time. When Trafficante rejected the offer, Anthony started a fight, which ultimately had to be broken up by Trafficante and his men. Ruggerio, with the permission of Vito Genovese, who ran the family's affairs from his prison cell, gained control of the northern part of the Jersey coast and sent Anthony there. In financial terms, it was like being sent to Siberia. The gambling business never brought in much money in that part of the coast. However, Russo managed to make the most out of the move. Gambling, loan sharking, unions, slot machines, construction contracts, Anthony tried to make money on literally everything. However, he did not give up his habits and continued to yap. It even got to the point where Anthony helped the FBI confirm its suspicions about Boiardo's involvement in the mysterious disappearance of Anthony Strollo. Anthony Strollo, also known as Tony Bender, was a capo in the Genovese family. It's believed that he betrayed his boss Vito, who had ordered his elimination, giving the hit contract to Boiardo. According to Anthony Russo, he once witnessed a conversation between Boiardo and Sam Mooney Giancana, then boss of the Chicago Mafia. In that conversation, Boiardo essentially took responsibility for Strollo's murder. Anthony could have paid dearly for his loose lips, but he was saved by the fact that he was in prison at the time for refusing to answer questions from a state grand jury in a corruption and racketeering case in Monmouth County. Anthony Russo was sentenced to 3 to 5 years in prison. Just as he was behind bars, the recordings made in the office of Sam DeCavalcante, the boss of the New Jersey family, became public knowledge. Among other things, the tapes included conversations between DeCavalcante, Gyp DeCarlo, and Anthony Russo. Anthony had outdone himself. In one conversation with Sam, he almost got to shouting, advising him to deal with gangster Lou LaRosso, because he allowed himself to treat Sam like dirt. The next time, he talked about how he once offered to take out Jimmy the Weasel Frontiano, the former boss of the Los Angeles family, who later became an informant. And while Gyp DeCarlo didn't have to worry about his future, Anthony's position was much more precarious, due to his big mouth. In fact, the only reason he was still alive was that, although he was a loudmouth, he wasn't a snitch. By the time the recordings from DeCarlo's office were published, Boiardo's team was going through a rough patch. Tony Boy was embroiled in a corruption scandal involving Newark Mayor Hugh Adonisio. 70-year-old Boiardo was preparing to serve a 3-year prison sentence for organizing illegal gambling. He and 18 of his subordinates were accused of running an illegal gambling business involving more than 400 participants, each of whom had an average annual income of more than $30,000. The situation was exacerbated when people whom Boiardo had trusted implicitly began cooperating with the FBI, such as Angelo Chieppa, who had been his accomplice for more than 30 years. Ultimately, charges of gambling, betrayal, and constant pressure from law enforcement undermined the team's ability to control its extensive network of criminal enterprises. But there were other problems as well. In 1967, Newark was rocked by race riots. The governor set up a special commission to investigate the causes. One of the findings was that corruption and bribery had engulfed the city, with many local officials suspected of aiding organized crime. The most serious accusations were leveled by Dominic Spina, the Newark police chief, who had been appointed largely thanks to the influence of Boiardo, DeCarlo, and Catena. The FBI managed to record a conversation between Tony Boy and Catena, during which they stated Spina could turn against those who paid him. In May 1968, another special grand jury was convened to investigate corruption in Newark. Spina was charged with violating state gambling laws. He submitted his resignation, but Mayor Adonisio rejected it. Dominic Spina, who had worked in the police since 1933, turned out to be a real thug himself. Not only did he help the mafia, but he also created his own criminal network of police officers. His men extorted money from bar owners for all sorts of violations, lack of licenses, and so on. 3 days before the charges were brought, Spina's living room window was targeted with a shotgun. Spina survived by a miracle, bending down to pet his dog just before the shot was fired. The FBI believed that Boiardo's men were behind the assassination attempt because they did not want him to talk. In the end, the court acquitted Spina due to a lack of evidence of criminal intent. The federal charges against Boiardo in the gambling case were initially dismissed due to legal technicality. The prosecution's case was based on the fact that Boiardo had not registered as required and had not paid his $50 fee. Despite the obvious pettiness and absurdity of this point, the prosecution built its case on it. However, a few months after the trial began, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the mandatory registration law was unconstitutional because it violated a number of federal laws. However, after an appeal filed by the prosecution, the trial continued, and on April 28, 1968, Boiardo and several of his accomplices were found guilty. As the judge sadly joked, this case alone cost more than the entire budget allocated for the whole year. At the same time, the FBI turned its attention to Boiardo's loan sharking business, which brought him an income of $1 million a year. It turned out that under his leadership, several criminal groups in Essex County had pooled their money to create a joint fund of $500,000. This fund was then used to issue loans with exorbitant interest rates. Boiardo's lawyers tried to contest these charges, but all their appeals were rejected, and his property, including his estate in Livingston, was seized. The press was anticipating juicy details, and it even got to the point where the police asked Boiardo to let them search the incinerator on his estate. Ruggerio told the cops that he didn't mind, but would like 3 days' notice. The boss joked with the police, saying that he needed the 3 days to remove the remains of bones and skulls from the furnace. Subsequently, no forensic examinations were carried out at Boiardo's estate, and the stories about burning bodies in the furnace turned out to be urban legends. On October 9, 1970, Boiardo was sent to Lewisburg Penitentiary to serve a 3-year sentence. In prison, he did not lose heart, but continued to do what he loved most, tending to flowers. A year later, at the age of 81, he was released. Things were not so rosy for his son Tony Boy. Together with Mayor Hugh Adonisio and 13 associates, including members of the local city council, he was accused of receiving millions in kickbacks for municipal construction projects. Many contracts went to young Boiardo's company, Valentine Electric, and other companies riddled with the mafia. A man came forward claiming to have witnessed Tony Boy personally threatening to break the legs of a disobedient contractor. In December 1969, Hugh Adonisio appeared before a federal grand jury. When asked if he was acquainted with Tony Boy, Adonisio, who had previously refused to answer questions citing the Fifth, stated that he knew him. A week later, federal charges were announced against Adonisio, Tony Boiardo, and several other politicians for racketeering and tax evasion. None of them pleaded guilty. When the trial began in the summer of 1970, Tony Boy, who had previously been released on $50,000 bail, was sent to prison. This was because several witnesses had received threatening phone calls the day before, and one of the witnesses, Paul Anderson, was hit by a car on his way to court. Somerset County Jail turned out to be a living hell for Tony Boy. He was 56 years old and had a whole host of health issues, ranging from ulcers to gallbladder problems. During the arraignment, he suffered a minor heart attack, according to his doctor. In the end, the younger Boiardo was released on bail and sent home. In the years that followed, federal prosecutor Frank Lacey repeatedly tried to get him back in court, but doctors said he was too ill to return to the dock. Although Tony Boy was often seen playing golf, he spent most of his time not at home with his family, but in hospitals. In 1978, at the age of 63, Tony Boiardo died of heart complications. As for the other participant in the trial, Mayor Hugh Adonisio, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, of which he served about 5. Upon his release, he returned home where he bred pigeons until his death. Meanwhile, serious changes took place in Newark. Kenneth Gibson became the first black mayor in the city's history. He vowed to replace Newark's police chief, Dominic Spina, saying that the city did not need the services of the mafia. Most likely, Boiardo and Spina found common ground after the hit attempt and continued their joint activities. The new administration did not bode well for Boiardo, so his team began to consider a plan to eliminate the new mayor. The FBI learned of this plan, but since the Bureau had no substantial evidence, no one was ever brought to justice. The FBI informed Gibson himself, but asked him not to reveal the source of the information. The feds knew that Boiardo suspected one of his aides of being a snitch. There were personnel changes in Boiardo's team. Former soldiers Thomas Pee Wee DePhillips, Anthony DeVingo, and Andy Girardo now came to the fore. In 1974, Anthony Russo was released from prison. By that time, drug trafficking was bringing in big money, but Boiardo was still against it. Anthony decided to approach the issue from a different angle. He convinced Boiardo that they could lend money to drug dealers. Ruggerio agreed. It was a lucrative business, albeit a dangerous one. For example, on April 2, 1976, Patrick "Patsy" Truglia, a local drug dealer who owned Russo about 50 grand, killed 3 of his men who had come to collect the debt at his home. Such incidents occurred from time to time, so Anthony asked Boiardo and the Genovese family bosses in New York for permission to rid Monmouth County of drug dealers by taking their money and throwing away their drugs. Permission was granted. Russo began to put so much pressure on local drug dealers that they had to turn to the police for help. In the late 1970s, Russo turned his attention to Jolly Trolley Casino in Las Vegas. On Boiardo's orders, Russo controlled this and another casino and paid bribes to local politicians to ensure the safety of the business. Russo not only collected tribute from casino owners, but managed them. He issued loans and hired and fired employees. Anthony was unaware that the FBI had been monitoring him for a while and recording his conversations. A road contractor, Richard Bonner, and Anthony's personal driver, Patrick Pizzuto, agreed to wear listening devices. As a result, agents obtained several dozen hours of compromising conversations. On August 22, 1978, the Bureau offered Anthony cooperation with the New Jersey Police and the Nevada Gaming Control Board, but he refused. A few months later, John Russo, Ruggiero's longtime assistant, was killed. According to eyewitnesses, Anthony wept bitterly at his brother's funeral and muttered that his insurance policy had expired. He was right. On April 26, 1979, Anthony Russo was killed in his own apartment. As the older Boiardo later said, it was for the best because he talked too much. A month after Anthony Russo's murder, New Jersey Attorney General John Degnan announced the arrest of 8 prominent Jersey mobsters, including Boiardo. All were charged with 24 counts, including nationwide criminal conspiracy. The charges were the result of a 2-year investigation that began with surveillance on Anthony Russo. In total, the charges included 79 criminal counts, including the attempted murder of Patsy Truglio and other drug dealers. Among others, Thomas Pee Wee DePhillips, Anthony DeVingo, Andy Girardo, and Ruggerio Boiardo, who was accused of being a high-ranking member of the Genovese family, were in the dock. The defendants were charged with murder, extortion, robbery, loan sharking, and other crimes. The trial itself did not go as the prosecution had hoped. The evidence of criminal activity presented in court was circumstantial, so it was not possible to put the entire criminal elite of Newark on death row. DeVingo was sentenced to 3 years in prison, Girardo to between 9 and 14 years, and a fine of $6,000. Pee Wee DePhillips took his lawyer's advice and pleaded guilty, receiving a sentence of 4 to 6 years for his cooperation. Only Boiardo, who was 89 at the time, pleaded not guilty. He was one of the oldest defendants ever to stand trial on organized crime charges. Then a federal grand jury began investigating Anthony Russo. Naturally, they were primarily interested in cases related to the Jolly Trolley Casino. Boiardo and the casino executives found themselves back in the dock. Boiardo began to have health problems during the investigation, but this did not prevent him, unlike other participants in the trial, from again pleading not guilty. After the trial ended, he finally returned to his estate, handing over leadership of the team to Andy Girardo and his associate, DePhillips. The empire that Boiardo had built was now a far cry from its heyday. Small-time loan sharking schemes, extortion of middle-class entrepreneurs, and bookmaking were all that remained of its former glory. Girardo tried for a while to behave like his great predecessor, but it was clear to everyone that times had changed. Boiardo spent the last years of his life at home with his family. On November 17, 1984, Ruggerio the Boot Boiardo died at the age of 93.